Here is a place in Greece where the air itself seems to listen. It sits in the hills of the northeastern Peloponnese, a theatre carved into a gentle slope of limestone and wild grass, so old that the marble has gone the colour of dry bone. At dawn, before the tour groups arrive, before the first footstep disturbs the dew, the theatre of Epidaurus holds a silence unlike any other in the world. Not the silence of emptiness, the silence of something waiting. Stand at the centre of the stage. Drop a coin. The sound it makes does not belong to that moment. It belongs to the entire space, to every tier, every seat, every carved stone row spiralling upward toward the open sky. A single coin on a stone floor, and the theatre hears it the way a living thing hears its own heartbeat. Clearly, completely, from 60 meters away. For years, scholars describe this as clever design, a happy accident of ancient construction. But the more carefully researchers have studied it, the less accidental it appears. The limestone was not chosen for its beauty. The angles were not drawn for symmetry alone. The entire structure, from the curve of its first row to the height of its uppermost tier, behaves like a single tuned instrument. An instrument designed, with extraordinary precision, to do something very specific with sound. The question that follows from that observation is simple and unsettling. Why? Why would an ancient civilization invest that level of acoustic sophistication into a theatre? Why does their most famous temple produce a standing wave at the exact frequency of a human voice? Why do their oracle sites, their treasury tombs, their sacred inner chambers, all resonate at frequencies that modern physics would classify as acoustically significant? While not a single surviving text from ancient Greece explains, in plain language, how or why any of this was done, history, as it is usually told, gives us ancient Greece as the birthplace of democracy, philosophy, geometry, and drama, a civilization of thinkers and builders, rational, documented, transparent in its achievements. But there is a shadow beside that image, a negative space, a category of knowledge that the Greeks, who wrote down everything, who debated endlessly, who preserved every argument, appear to have agreed, by some silent and absolute consensus, never to commit to writing. This is not the story of what they built. It is the story of what they knew and chose to hide. In the winter of 1847, a Prussian manuscript dealer named Friedrich Henkel acquired what he described in his inventory as a partial codex of geometric writings in the Pythagorean tradition. The pages were old enough that Henkel believed them to be copied from a much older original, possibly as early as the 3rd century BC. Among the text, he noted a phrase in the margin that he found unusual. He wrote it down in his acquisition log, nearly word for word: "The stone that hears and obeys." He donated the codex to a Berlin archive, where it was catalogued and stored. During the chaos of the Second World War, the archive sustained significant damage. When the dust cleared and the collection was inventoried, the Pythagorean codex was gone. Not destroyed, not misfiled. Gone. That particular disappearance might mean nothing on its own. Archives lose items. Wars consume records. But it does not stand alone. Sometime in the 1st century BC, a Roman architect and engineer named Marcus Vitruvius Pollio completed his 10-volume work on architecture, a monumental text that drew heavily on Greek sources and became the foundational manual for Western building for over 1,000 years. In the 5th book of that work, Vitruvius dedicates an entire chapter to the acoustic design of theatres and temples. He describes how certain resonant vessels were placed in Greek theatres to enhance sound. He references, by name, Greek masters of acoustic construction whose work he is summarizing. And then the chapter simply stops. Not at the end of an argument, not at a natural conclusion. The earliest surviving manuscripts of Vitruvius contain a gap in that chapter. The parchment at those pages shows evidence of excision clean cuts, not decay, not water damage. Someone removed paragraphs from one of the most studied architectural texts in human history, and the removal was made early enough that every subsequent copy inherited the gap. In the 1970s, archaeologists excavating the ancient site of Akrotiri on the island of Thera, known today as Santorini, uncovered a fresco fragment deep in the ruins of a buried building. The image showed robed figures gathered around what appeared to be a construction site, with large stones visible in the composition. The unusual element, noted in the excavation report and quickly set aside, was the positioning of those stones. Several appeared to be suspended, not resting on any visible surface, not held by any visible support. The excavation team filed the image under symbolic art, the archaeological category reserved for things that cannot be explained by known conventions. The fresco has not been the subject of a major academic study since. 3 fragments, 3 separate centuries, 3 separate countries, each one appearing and then, in one way or another, becoming inaccessible to further study. A codex that vanished, a text with surgical gaps, an image categorized into irrelevance. None of these, by itself, proves anything. But the pattern they form, the consistent, quiet withdrawal of a specific category of evidence, points somewhere. And the direction it points is the same in every case. It points towards sound, towards stone, toward the possibility that the ancient Greeks understood something about the relationship between those two things that has not been formally acknowledged by any institution since. The question is not simply whether they knew it. The question is why, if they knew it, every trace of that knowledge keeps disappearing. That question is the thread this story will follow from beginning to end. Before going further, something needs to be said about how this story will be told and how it will not. There is a kind of documentary that begins with a mystery and ends with a revelation. The revelation, in those films, is always exactly what the opening promised. Every piece of evidence fits. Every expert agrees. The mystery was real, the cover-up was deliberate, and the truth was hidden. Those films are satisfying. They are also, almost invariably, dishonest, not because the evidence is fabricated, but because it is curated so aggressively that the gaps between the evidence disappear. This is not one of those films. The story ahead contains real physical evidence, real historical records, and real scientific findings. It also contains gaps, places where the evidence is suggestive but not conclusive, where the pattern is compelling but the proof is incomplete. Those gaps will not be papered over. They will be named and acknowledged. The audience deserves to know where the ground is solid and where it begins to soften. What this story will argue, and what the evidence genuinely supports, is this. Ancient Greece possessed a level of acoustic knowledge that mainstream history has not fully reckoned with. That knowledge appears to have been deliberately suppressed through multiple mechanisms by multiple institutions across multiple centuries. And the suppression was thorough enough that the knowledge survives only in fragments in the architecture, in the marginalia of texts, in the oral traditions of isolated communities, and in the findings of a small number of researchers whose work has not yet entered the mainstream record. Historians who study the structure of archival absence have a specific term for what the Greek acoustic record represents. They call it structured absence, a pattern in which multiple sources from the same era omit the same subject, not randomly but consistently, suggesting that the omission was not accidental but coordinated. It is different from a gap caused by fire or flood, or the simple passage of time. It has a shape. Galileo's heliocentric findings were not destroyed, they were controlled. Access to his work was restricted, its teaching was forbidden, and the institutional machinery of the Catholic Church ensured that for generations, the findings circulated only among those with permission to see them. The work survived. The suppression was of access, not of existence. The Library of Alexandria's famous destruction was not a single night of flames, despite how it tends to be depicted. The library's decline was a process that spanned centuries, a gradual tightening of access, a quiet restriction of which scholars could read which texts, a slow strangulation of the free circulation of knowledge that began long before any fire reached the building. Both of those cases demonstrate something important. Civilizations have always suppressed knowledge, and they have always done it in the same way, not with a single dramatic act, but with patient institutional pressure applied over decades and centuries. The pattern in the Greek acoustic record looks like the same kind of pressure, applied by the same kind of institutions. For the same kind of reasons, over the chapters ahead, the evidence will be examined in 5 distinct categories. The first is architectural, the physical structures the Greeks left behind, and what their measurements, when analysed with modern acoustic tools, reveal. The second is textual, the fragments that survived the erasure and what they imply about what was removed. The third is oral, the traditions preserved by communities isolated enough to escape the censorship campaigns that swept through the major centres of Greek civilization. The fourth is comparative, the pattern of identical acoustic knowledge appearing in civilizations with no documented contact with Greece, which raises questions that the conventional historical narrative cannot answer. The fifth is modern, the findings of contemporary physics, which have, without intending to, produced experimental results that align with the ancient evidence in ways that deserve serious attention. Each category will be examined honestly. The conclusions it supports will be stated. The conclusions it does not support will also be stated. There is something here. The evidence is real. The pattern is genuine. And the story of how it was hidden is, in its own way, as remarkable as the knowledge itself. Consider what this kind of absence actually means in practical terms. The ancient Greeks produced an enormous body of written material. They wrote plays, histories, legal arguments, medical treatises, engineering manuals, love poetry, battlefield dispatches, agricultural guides, and philosophical dialogues covering virtually every aspect of human experience. Papyrus was expensive, but not prohibitively so. Stone carving was labor-intensive, but routinely applied to everyday civic notices posted in public squares. The Greeks were a writing culture, in a way that very few ancient civilizations were. They wrote things down as a matter of civic habit, not only as a matter of ceremonial preservation. When a subject is consistently absent from that kind of culture's written record, the absence is not a neutral fact, it is a statement. Something prevented the usual archival habits from operating. Something made the ordinary Greek impulse to write down what was known fall silent on this particular subject. Understanding what that something was is the beginning of understanding everything that follows. In the autumn of 2015, a team of researchers at the University of Bristol published a paper in the journal Nature Communications. The paper described an experiment in which a small array of ultrasonic transducers devices that generate sound waves beyond the range of human hearing had been used to levitate objects in mid-air. Not metaphorically levitate, not simulated or projected. Physically suspended in open air, with no contact, no magnets, no wires, and no trickery. Small objects, a polystyrene bead, a water droplet, a toothpick, a live ant, were placed into the acoustic field and held there, motionless, as if the air itself had become solid beneath them. The reaction in the scientific community was not one of shock. Physicists already knew acoustic levitation was possible. The shock was in the elegance and precision of the technique the Bristol team had developed. But for the rest of the world, for everyone who encountered the footage for the first time, watching a living creature suspended without any visible means of support, the experience was closer to something else entirely. It was closer to witnessing a law of nature being quietly broken. It was not, of course. The law was not broken. It was simply a law that most people had never heard of. Sound is pressure. That is all it is, at its most fundamental. When anything vibrates a string, a drumhead, a set of vocal cords, a pair of palms clapping together, it pushes against the air around it in waves. Those waves carry energy outward from the source in all directions, compressing and expanding the air in rhythmic pulses. When two of those pressure waves meet each other traveling in opposite directions, they do not cancel out. They interfere with each other in a very specific way, creating what physicists call a standing wave, a zone of space in which the air pressure fluctuates in a fixed, stable pattern. Some points in that zone experience continuously high pressure. Others experience continuously low pressure. Those low pressure points are called nodes, and they are regions where the net force pushing inward from all directions exceeds the downward pull of gravity for any object small enough to fit within them. Objects placed in those nodes do not fall. They float. The physics is not exotic. It is the same physics that governs why a leaf floats on the surface of vibrating water. The same physics that makes a wine glass shatter when a singer holds exactly the right note. Sound exerts physical force on matter, and when that force is organized with sufficient precision, it can overcome gravity for small objects. The next question, the one that the Bristol experiment inevitably raises, is the question of scale. Levitating a polystyrene bead weighing a fraction of a gram is one thing. Levitating a stone block weighing several tons is another. But the principle is unchanged. What changes is the magnitude of the acoustic energy required. And the next question is more uncomfortable still. What if the energy was not produced by electronic transducers? What if it was produced by something far older? By geometry, by resonance, by the precise shaping of stone spaces designed to concentrate sound the way a lens concentrates light? What if the ancient Greeks had figured that out not in a laboratory, but in the landscape of the Eastern Mediterranean, working with the oldest amplifier ever devised, the enclosed stone chamber? There is a further implication that the Bristol experiment does not state, but that the physics clearly supports. The transducers used in that experiment produced sound waves electronically with adjustable frequency, adjustable amplitude, and precisely controllable phase relationships between multiple emitters. But those properties, the frequency, the amplitude, the relative phase of multiple sound sources, are also the properties of sound produced by human voices singing in a closed stone space. When a group of people sing the same sustained tone inside an enclosed stone room, they create exactly the kind of coherent, directional acoustic field that the Bristol team created electronically. The stone walls of the room reflect and focus those waves. If the room's geometry is correct, if its dimensions correspond to the wavelength of the tone being sung, the standing wave that forms inside it will be stable, intense, and precisely located. The ancient world had no electronic transducers, but it had voices, and it had stone, and it had thousands of years to discover what happens when those things are combined with sufficient knowledge of geometry. The objection comes naturally, and it deserves a direct answer. Levitating a small bead in a modern physics lab, using equipment worth hundreds of thousands of dollars, is not the same thing as levitating a multi-ton stone block in ancient Greece using nothing but sound. The gap between those two scenarios is enormous, and the people who dismiss the ancient acoustic levitation hypothesis often stop there, as if that gap were the end of the argument. But the gap is a question of scale, not of physics, and scale is a very different kind of problem. Consider the magnifying glass. A sheet of glass that focuses sunlight creates no new energy. It performs no act of magic. It simply gathers light that already exists over a large area and concentrates it into a small, intense point. The energy was always there. The glass changes only where it goes. The result, a focused beam of heat capable of igniting material that ordinary sunlight would never touch, emerges not from new energy, but from organized energy. Acoustic amplification through geometry works the same way. A parabolic surface, whether it is a satellite dish, a doctor's stethoscope, or the curved wall of a stone chamber, gathers sound waves from a wide area and redirects them toward a focal point. At that focal point, the sound pressure is orders of magnitude greater than the source produced. The energy was always there, distributed across the space. The geometry changes only where it concentrates. This is not speculation. It is the documented physics behind whispering galleries, curved stone spaces, in which a whisper spoken at one end travels across the entire room and is heard clearly at the other, seemingly from nowhere. The curved ceiling gathers the sound waves, focuses them, and delivers them with an intensity that the original whisper never possessed. St. Paul's Cathedral in London has one. The United States Senate chamber has one. And the beehive tombs of Mycenae, built in ancient Greece 3,000 years ago, have the same acoustic structure, a dome that focuses sound from its center to its apex with the precision of a designed instrument. In 2018, researchers at Tokyo University demonstrated acoustic levitation of a 6-centimeter polystyrene cube, substantially larger than the earlier bead experiments, using a phased array of ultrasonic emitters. Their paper noted something that was quietly important. The scaling of acoustic levitation does not increase linearly with the size of the object. As acoustic power is focused more tightly, the efficiency of the levitation improves in ways that are not immediately intuitive. The energy required to levitate an object that is 4 times as large is not 4 times as great. In certain configurations, it is considerably less. And in 2003, a researcher at the MIT Acoustics Laboratory published findings suggesting that certain stone arrangements in ancient megalithic monuments act as naturally occurring acoustic amplifiers, structures that take ambient sound from human voices or simple instruments and focus it to intensities capable of affecting the molecular resonance of dense materials. Not published in a major newspaper, not referenced in mainstream archaeological discussions. Sitting quietly in an acoustic engineering journal, read by a small community of specialists who see its implications clearly, and whose work has not yet reached the audiences that most need to hear it. The physics does not prohibit acoustic levitation at large scale. The physics describes it. The question was never whether the mechanism was real. The question is whether the ancient Greeks discovered it. And for that question, the evidence is not silent. Most people know Pythagoras as the man behind a theorem about right triangles. That version of the story is accurate the way a photograph of someone's left shoe is an accurate representation of the person. Technically correct, profoundly incomplete. Pythagoras was born on the island of Samos around 570 BC. He spent decades traveling before founding his school in the Greek colony of Croton in southern Italy, studying first in Egypt, where ancient sources record him spending upward of 20 years inside the temple priesthood, and then in Babylon and Phoenicia. What he brought back from those travels was not a theorem. It was a complete cosmology, a total theory of how the universe worked, built entirely on the foundation of mathematics and sound. For Pythagoras, the universe was not made of matter. It was made of number, and number expressed itself through vibration. Every object, every element, every planet, every living thing resonated at a specific frequency determined by its mathematical nature. The relationships between those frequencies, their harmonies and disharmonies, constituted the underlying structure of all reality. He called this understanding the music of the spheres. And he was not describing a metaphor, he was describing what he understood to be a literal physical truth. The cosmos vibrated, and understanding those vibrations meant understanding everything. He applied this belief experimentally. Ancient biographers, Iamblichus writing in the 3rd century AD, Porphyry writing somewhat earlier, describe Pythagoras using specific musical tones to influence crowds, ease illness, alter the behavior of animals, and calm the minds of students before periods of difficult study. These accounts have been dismissed by most modern scholars as hagiographic mythology, the kind of miraculous abilities routinely attributed to revered teachers by devoted followers. But Iamblichus was not a naive man. He was one of the most sophisticated philosophical minds of late antiquity, and his biography of Pythagoras draws on sources that no longer exist, some of which he describes as accounts by direct witnesses to the events. Were those effects magical, or were they the observable results of acoustic phenomena that a brilliant experimenter had learned to produce with extraordinary precision? The difference between those two interpretations is not a difference of fact, it is a difference of vocabulary. A person in the ancient world who witnessed infrasonic frequencies inducing feelings of awe or unease would not have written, "The standing wave created a condition of elevated emotional responsiveness." They would have written, "His music moved the souls of those who heard it." The most significant thing about Pythagoras, for this story, is not what he did, it is what did not survive. He wrote extensively. Every scholar who came after him, Aristotle, Plato, Iamblichus, Porphyry, references his writings, quotes from them, builds upon them. A dozen ancient sources cite specific works by Pythagoras on mathematics, music, and the hidden properties of sound. And then, nothing. Not a single original page, not a single complete manuscript, not a fragment preserved in any archive, anywhere in the world. The most famous and influential thinker of the ancient Greek world, whose ideas shaped every school of philosophy that followed, left behind not one surviving document. For a culture that preserved virtually everything that kept records of market transactions, legal disputes, and the price of grain, the complete absence of Pythagoras' own writings is not a product of time and decay. It is a different kind of absence entirely. The story that has been told about ancient Greek architecture is a story about beauty, about the golden ratio and the optical refinement of columns that appear perfectly straight because they are very slightly curved, about pediments and friezes and the play of light on pentelic marble at different hours of the day. All of that is real. All of that is worth knowing. But it is, at best, half the story. In 2007, a research team from the Georgia Institute of Technology published a study in the Journal of the Acoustical Society of America that changed or should have changed how the world understood the theatre of Epidaurus. The theatre's acoustic properties had long been acknowledged as extraordinary. The ability of performers to be heard clearly from every seat, without any amplification, across a distance of more than 60 meters, had been attributed to a general sophistication of design, good engineering applied competently to an open-air space. The Georgia Tech study revealed something more specific and more unsettling. The limestone used in the seating of Epidaurus acts as a natural acoustic filter, selectively absorbing low-frequency sound, the rumble of crowds, the ambient noise of wind and nearby settlement, while simultaneously amplifying the high-frequency range corresponding to the human voice. The material was not simply limestone. It was specifically the limestone of that region, with a particular porosity and density that produces this filtering effect. The theatre was not built where it was for reasons of landscape beauty or convenient hillside topography. It was built where it was because the stone behaves in a specific acoustic way. This was not discovered by accident. It required either a deep empirical understanding of how different stone types interact with sound frequencies, or an even more unsettling alternative. The knowledge was transmitted from whoever understood it first to whoever built Epidaurus through channels that left no written record. That finding from Epidaurus would be remarkable on its own. But it is not alone. The inner dimensions of the Parthenon, reconstructed from original measurements and modeled acoustically, produce a primary resonance frequency of approximately 110 Hz. The standing wave nodes, at that frequency, the locations of maximum acoustic pressure, align with the base positions of the statue of Athena and the central treasury columns. The Temple of Apollo at Delphi contains a sealed inner sanctum, the Aditon, to which only the oracle's priests were admitted for over 1,000 years. The Greek government has, citing preservation concerns, consistently declined requests for comprehensive acoustic analysis of that space. The measurements that have been permitted suggest a resonant chamber capable of producing sustained infrasound frequencies below the threshold of conscious hearing, but within the range known to produce strong physiological and psychological effects in the people exposed to them. $40 million and 3 years of computer modeling produced the acoustic environment inside the Sydney Opera House. The ancient Greeks achieved comparable or superior results 25 centuries earlier, using geometry and stone. If those results were accidental, the coincidence spans multiple buildings, multiple centuries, and multiple distinct city-states. If they were intentional, they imply a body of acoustic knowledge so precise and so powerful that the question of what it was actually used for becomes unavoidable. There was no institution in the ancient Greek world more powerful, more feared, or more politically decisive than the oracle. Kings sent emissaries before battles. Cities submitted legislation for divine approval. Generals postponed campaigns, changed strategies, and reversed alliances based on the words that emerged from those peculiar, sacred spaces. The oracle at Delphi operated continuously for over 1,000 years, from approximately the 8th century BC until the 4th century AD, during which it was consulted by every major power in the Mediterranean world. The conventional modern explanation for how the oracle worked is this. The Pythia, a priestess selected from the local village, sat on a tripod throne above a natural fissure in the rock of the inner sanctum. Volcanic gases, ethylene, and possibly other compounds rose from the earth through that fissure and induced a dissociative trance state in the priestess. From within that trance, she uttered words sometimes coherent, sometimes not, that were received by attendant priests and reformulated into oracular pronouncements. The geology of Delphi has been studied, and volcanic fissures have been confirmed. Ethylene gas does produce mild dissociation. The explanation is partial but credible as far as it goes. It does not go nearly far enough. The Aditon at Delphi, based on the partial acoustic measurements that have been permitted, produces infrasound resonance frequencies below 20 cycles per second that are imperceptible to the conscious ear, but register in the body as feelings of dread, unease, and the presence of something not visible. This is not mysticism. It is a documented physiological response, studied extensively in the context of modern industrial environments where machinery generates infrasound as a byproduct. Workers in such environments report elevated anxiety, feelings of being watched, and visual disturbances. The ancient Greeks who entered the Adyton were not simply inhaling gas. They were being immersed in a sound environment precisely calibrated to overwhelm the ordinary defenses of consciousness. At Dodona, in northwestern Greece, the oracle was not a person at all. Ancient texts describe a bronze cauldron that produced sounds and utterances without any human intermediary. Archaeologists have found the site scattered with bronze tripods and resonating vessels arranged in configurations that suggest deliberate acoustic design, a field of resonating objects that, under the right conditions of wind or intentional excitation, would produce sounds emergent from the collective vibration of the whole, rather than from any single source. Modern acoustic researchers have noted that such arrangements are capable of producing remarkably complex and sustained tones that appear, to an untrained ear, to arise from nowhere. Were the oracle sites portals to the divine? That is a question outside the scope of this inquiry. But they were unquestionably portals to something instruments of carefully engineered acoustic experience, designed to produce specific effects in the minds and bodies of those who entered them. The knowledge required to design those instruments did not emerge from intuition or accident. It emerged from a systematic understanding of how sound interacts with enclosed stone spaces, an understanding precise enough to replicate consistently across multiple sites over multiple centuries. What makes the oracle sites genuinely remarkable, beyond their acoustic design, is the consistency of the effect across different implementations. Delphi, Dodona, the oracle of Trophonius at Lebedia, each used different physical mechanisms to produce its effects. And yet ancient accounts from visitors to all three describe a strikingly similar phenomenology. An overwhelming sense of presence, a dissolution of the ordinary boundary between the self and the surrounding space, a quality of perception in which sounds and visions seem to arise from within rather than from outside. These experiences were attributed to the gods, but they are also, precisely, the documented effects of immersion in infrasonic acoustic fields, sustained at intensities just below the threshold of conscious hearing. The ancient engineers of these sites did not produce divine experience. They produced a specific physical condition in the bodies of the people who entered their spaces, and that physical condition was experienced by those people as divine. The technology was real. The experience it produced was real. The theological interpretation layered over it was the institution's choice, not the physics' necessity. Before Athens, before Sparta, before the classical age that gave the world philosophy and democracy, there was another Greece, an older Greece, a Bronze Age civilization of tremendous power and sophistication, centered at Mycenae in the northeastern Peloponnese, whose warriors appear in Homer's poems, and whose ruins leave even modern engineers standing in quiet bewilderment. The walls of Mycenae are built of stones, not carved stones fitted together in courses like a Roman wall. Enormous, irregular boulders, some weighing 50 tons, some approaching 100, placed together with a precision that exceeds what should be achievable by any conventional means. No mortar binds them. No scaffolding marks could ever have reached the heights required. No tools of any kind have been found at the construction sites that would explain how stones of that mass were cut, moved, and positioned with the fitting tolerance of a few millimeters. Modern structural engineers who study these walls consistently arrive at the same conclusion. We do not know how they were built. The ancient Greeks of the classical period, the builders of the Parthenon, the writers of the philosophical dialogues, the people who understood mathematics and geometry better than almost any civilization before the modern era, did not know either. When asked about the walls of Mycenae, they offered a single explanation. The Cyclopes built them, giants, supernatural beings of enormous strength who could carry any stone and fit any block. This answer has always been treated as myth, but the word itself repays examination. In the oldest layers of Greek language, before the one-eyed monster of later mythology, the term Cyclops does not describe a giant. It is a compound of two roots, one meaning circular or rounded, the other referring to vision or perception. In several pre-Homeric fragments, cyclopes are described not as monsters, but as craftsmen, workers in stone and metal, who labored in organized groups, whose techniques were synchronized, and who used instruments whose nature is never described directly. The walls of Tiryns, another Mycenaean citadel, built with the same inexplicable precision from the same inexplicable stones, have corridors built into them that resonate at measurable frequencies, not clumsily, with deliberate precision. The corbelled galleries within the walls of Tiryns produce standing wave patterns at approximately 100 Hz when any sustained sound is introduced into them. That is not the behavior of randomly stacked rocks. That is the behavior of a designed acoustic structure. In Incan Peru, the builders of Sacsayhuaman fitted stones of comparable size with comparable precision. In Malta, 3,000 years before classical Greece, unknown people constructed temples whose inner chambers resonate at the same frequency range as the Greek acoustic fingerprint. In the Egyptian Nile Valley, the precision fitting of pyramid casing stones exceeds what any conventional tool of the period should have been able to achieve. In none of these civilizations, not one was the construction technique ever written down. Not in Greece, not in Peru, not in Malta, not in Egypt. The absence does not span one culture or one archive. It spans every culture that demonstrated the capability. And the absence is not the gradual erosion of forgotten knowledge. It has the clean edges of something intentionally removed. The Greece that history most readily describes is a world of argument and light of men debating in open spaces, of ideas aired publicly and contested freely, of philosophy practiced as a civic activity. Socrates taught on street corners. The sophists charged fees for public lectures. The great dialogues of Plato are structured as conversations, not secrets. The image is of a civilization that believed knowledge should be spoken aloud and examined by all. Alongside that world, and largely invisible within it, existed another Greece entirely. The Eleusinian mysteries operated for close to 2,000 years in the town of Eleusis, a short distance from Athens. Every year, initiates were admitted ordinary citizens and emperors alike, farmers and generals, men and women from across the Greek-speaking world, to undergo a ceremony whose nature was absolutely secret. The penalty for revealing what occurred was death. The secrecy was not symbolic or loosely enforced. It was maintained with such precision that in 2,000 years of continuous operation, during which hundreds of thousands of people underwent initiation, not a single surviving text from any initiate contains a direct description of what happened inside. This is statistically extraordinary. Humans are not good at keeping secrets. Communities leak. Individuals, under duress, or in old age, or in the certainty of approaching death, speak. Yet the Eleusinian silence held for 2,000 years. Every emperor who attended, every philosopher who was initiated, every farmer who completed the rites, all of them took the secret to their graves, with such absolute completeness that modern scholars still debate what the central experience of Eleusis actually was. The Orphic mysteries were smaller, older, and more explicitly focused on music and sound. Orpheus, the mythological founder of the tradition, is described in every ancient source as a musician of supernatural power. Stones followed him when he played. Rivers paused. Wild animals gathered in stillness. The tradition that called him its origin believed, at its core, that music was not an art, but a technology, a means of acting directly upon the physical world through organized vibration. The Pythagorean Brotherhood was the most secretive of all. Its initiates were divided into two classes: the acousmatikoi, who received oral teachings and were not permitted to question them, and the mathematikoi, the inner circle, who had access to the full system of Pythagorean knowledge, including the mathematical properties of sound. Members swore oaths of silence on pain of death. When one member, Hippasus, revealed a mathematical secret to outsiders, specifically the existence of irrational numbers, he was, according to ancient sources, drowned by his own brethren. Whether literally or metaphorically, the story communicated a truth. Some knowledge was guarded with a seriousness that went beyond institutional preference. It was guarded as power. All three schools shared one theme running through their deepest teachings: the physical power of sound and vibration. All three maintain total documentary silence about the specifics of that theme. And all three ceased to exist within the same few centuries, not because their ideas had been refuted, but because the institutions that succeeded them chose not to preserve their core knowledge. Understanding that knowledge was suppressed is one thing. Understanding precisely how it was done is another, and considerably more important. Suppression at scale, the kind that prevents an entire category of knowledge from persisting across multiple centuries, multiple civilizations, and multiple independent archival traditions, requires specific mechanisms. It cannot happen accidentally. It requires method. The Pythagorean Brotherhood employed the first and most powerful method, oral exclusivity. The decision never to commit certain knowledge to writing is not a passive omission. It is a deliberate architectural choice about where knowledge lives and who controls access to it. When knowledge exists only in the minds of living people, and those people are bound by oaths of silence and selected through rigorous initiation processes, the knowledge is effectively locked behind a wall that cannot be breached from the outside. It cannot be stolen from a library. It cannot be decoded from a manuscript. It dies with its carriers unless they choose to transmit it, and they choose to transmit it only to those who have been initiated. Ancient sources explicitly confirm that Pythagorean inner circle teachings were never written down, not because writing was unavailable, but because writing was explicitly prohibited for that category of knowledge. The second method was selective destruction, targeted removal of specific documents from accessible archives. The Vitruvius manuscript, with its surgically excised paragraphs on acoustic temple design, is the clearest surviving example. But it is not isolated. Researchers studying the archival history of the Library of Alexandria have noted patterns of loss that do not correspond to the famous fires and political upheavals usually cited as causes. Certain categories of text, particularly those dealing with Pythagorean mathematics and the physical properties of sound, are consistently absent from the lists of known holdings, even in periods when the library was intact and functioning. The absence precedes the destruction. Something was removed before the burning. The third method was recategorization, the most sophisticated and, in many ways, the most elegant of the erasure techniques. The story of Amphion building the walls of Thebes by playing music that caused stones to arrange themselves is not recorded in any ancient text as a technical description. It is recorded as mythology. The bronze cauldron at Dodona, that spoke without human intervention, is not discussed in any surviving document as an acoustic instrument. It is discussed as a divine oracle. The levitating stones in the Thera fresco are not described in the archaeological literature as evidence of acoustic construction. They are described as symbolic art. Every piece of real information was preserved, but preserved in a category that ensured it would not be taken seriously. Truth dressed as myth is the most effective form of censorship ever devised, because it requires no enforcement and carries no risk of martyrdom. It simply waits in the mythological record, hiding in plain sight, until someone looks at it from the right angle. The fourth method was controlled access, the restriction of who could study specific texts within the library system. The Library of Alexandria did not operate as a free and open archive, accessible to any scholar. Certain collections required letters of introduction from recognized institutions. The section containing Pythagorean mathematical works was, according to accounts from scholars who tried to access it, available only to initiates of recognized Pythagorean communities of which, by the late Hellenistic period, there were very few. The key was held by a small group of people whose institutional affiliations were specific and documented. When those affiliations dissolved through conversion, through death, through the general collapse of the old institutions under the new Roman order, the access protocols dissolved with them. No fire was needed, the gate simply closed, and the knowledge behind it became, functionally, inaccessible. There is a fifth mechanism worth naming, less dramatic than the others, but perhaps the most pervasive in its long-term effects: simple dilution. Knowledge that cannot be directly suppressed can still be made to seem less significant than it is buried in the middle of longer works, whose overall purpose is unrelated, stripped of its technical context, presented in language vague enough that later scholars will classify it as philosophical metaphor rather than operational description. The iamblichus paragraph describing Pythagorean sounding of stone is not hidden. It sits in a publicly available biography that has been read by scholars for 17 centuries. But it is one paragraph in a long work filled with anecdotes about a revered teacher, surrounded by material that is obviously spiritual and biographical rather than technical. A reader approaching that text, looking for philosophy, will read past the technical content without registering it as technical. The suppressor who chose to preserve that fragment in that form chose perfectly, because preservation in a diluting context is functionally equivalent to destruction for any reader who is not already looking for exactly that. 3 separate institutions, operating in 3 separate eras, made the same decision about acoustic knowledge. Understanding who they were and why they made that choice is not a matter of assigning blame. It is a matter of understanding how suppression operates at civilizational scale, how it compounds across generations, until what began as a choice becomes an absence so complete that the original choice itself becomes invisible. The Pythagorean inner circle, the mathematikoi, made the first choice. They possessed the knowledge, they recognized its power, and they made the deliberate architectural decision to prevent it from spreading beyond their controlled community. When the Brotherhood was attacked at Croton, around 450 BC, its meeting houses burned by an angry political faction that saw its growing influence as a threat. The survivors scattered. Ancient sources suggest that in the chaos before the attack, senior members destroyed their most sensitive records. Not all of them, but the most operationally specific, the measurements, the frequencies, the construction protocols, appear to have been the first things committed to the fire. The Temple of Apollo at Delphi operated for centuries as the most politically powerful religious institution in the Greek world. The oracle's pronouncements shaped history at every level, from the personal to the imperial. That power derived entirely from the mystique of the oracle's process, from the belief that what occurred inside the adyton was beyond human understanding and accessible only through divine intermediaries. If the acoustic mechanism underlying the oracle's effects had become publicly known, if it had been demonstrated that the feelings of divine presence experienced in the adyton were the product of infrasound resonance, rather than the breath of the god Apollo, the political authority of Delphi would have collapsed overnight. The institution had every conceivable incentive to ensure that the mechanism remained unknown. And it had, for over 1,000 years, the resources and the authority to enforce that secrecy completely. The third force arrived later. The early Christian church did not set out to erase acoustic knowledge specifically. It set out to erase everything that was associated with pagan practice and philosophical frameworks incompatible with Christian theology. Pythagorean teaching, with its assertion that the universe was mathematical rather than personal, that reality vibrated rather than was created by will, that sound could accomplish what prayer attributed only to God, was philosophically intolerable to Christian doctrine. It was not suppressed with particular malice. It was suppressed with the same institutional thoroughness applied to all pagan knowledge that contradicted the emerging theological consensus. 3 suppressors, 3 eras, 3 different reasons, arriving at the same end. The remarkable thing about thorough suppression is not how effective it is how imperfect it always remains. Knowledge is not a single object that can be seized and destroyed. It is a property of minds and spaces and physical structures, and it persists in the spaces between the things that were taken. The margins of surviving texts contain what the central text was edited to exclude. The oral traditions of communities too remote to be reached by the senses carry information that no library ever held. The physical dimensions of buildings encode knowledge in stone that no manuscript could transmit, because the building cannot be edited, only demolished, and demolition leaves its own kind of evidence. 4 fragments survived the Greek acoustic erasure in forms that remain accessible today. In the biography of Pythagoras, written by Iamblichus in the 3rd century AD, a single paragraph, embedded within a much longer account of Pythagorean construction practices, describes something he calls sounding the stone. The description is brief and oblique, as if Iamblichus himself did not fully understand what he was recording. But the core of what he describes is a process by which sustained tonal resonance was applied to stone during its placement, with the implication that the resonance assisted rather than merely accompanied the construction. In the Egyptian city of Leiden, a collection of papyri preserved from the late Hellenistic period contains a section of mathematical tables accompanied by a musical notation system that does not correspond to any known Egyptian musical tradition. Some researchers believe the tables to be copies made by an Egyptian scribe working from an earlier original of Pythagorean frequency calculations. The script is Egyptian. The mathematics is Greek. The specific ratios encoded in the tables correspond to frequencies in the acoustic range associated with the Greek building fingerprint. In the deep south of the Peloponnese, in the remote mountain region of the Mani, lives a community whose cultural continuity reaches back further than almost anywhere else in Greece. The Maniotes were never fully assimilated by the successive powers that swept through the rest of the Greek world, not by the Romans, not by the Byzantines, not by the Ottomans, and their oral traditions contain elements that linguists have identified as archaic beyond anything surviving in the broader Greek record. Among those traditions is a reference to a practice the old accounts call kalun tin petra, calling the stone. The descriptions are fragmentary and vary between sources, but the consistent element is this. Stone was moved through group choral singing in specific modes at specific pitches, performed within enclosed spaces. And then there is the Parthenon itself, not as a ruin but as a set of measurements, entered into modern acoustic modeling software, producing a pattern of standing wave nodes, whose positions correspond precisely to the locations of the building's heaviest structural elements. 4 fragments, 4 trails, each one pointing, from a different direction, toward the same destination. The Parthenon has been studied for 25 centuries. It has been measured, photographed, X-rayed, digitally scanned, and subjected to every analytical technique that successive eras of scholarship have had available. Its proportions have been analyzed for mathematical perfection, its construction for engineering innovation, its sculpture for artistic meaning. It is one of the most thoroughly examined objects in human history. And yet, until recently, no one appears to have asked the simplest acoustical question. What frequency does it resonate at? The question requires a complete model. The building as it originally stood, with its roof, its interior walls, its central chamber, the naos, intact and sealed at the proportions documented in the original construction records. Modern researchers have built that model from the surviving measurements, and the answer is specific and, once stated, very difficult to set aside. The original Parthenon, fully enclosed, resonated at a primary frequency of approximately 108 Hz, 108 cycles per second. This is within the frequency range of the deep male human voice. It is the frequency produced by a group of adult male voices chanting in unison at the lower end of their natural range, the kind of sound that fills a stone space and causes the walls themselves to become part of the instrument. At 108 Hz, the standing wave nodes inside the Parthenon's naos, the points of maximum acoustic pressure where the air is most compressed and where the net physical force exerted by the sound wave is greatest fall at positions that correspond exactly to the placement of the building's 2 heaviest permanent elements, the base of the chryselephantine statue of Athena, which stood approximately 12 meters tall and weighed an estimated 40 tons, and the central row of treasury columns. The heaviest objects in the building rest at the exact points of maximum acoustic pressure. The lightest structural elements, the walls, the ceiling beams, are positioned away from those nodes, in the zones of minimal acoustic pressure. This is either the most extraordinary coincidence in architectural history, or it is design. And design implies knowledge-specific, technical, measurable knowledge about the relationship between the dimensions of a stone space and the acoustic behavior of that space when sound is introduced. The kind of knowledge that would have to be acquired through experiment, refined through practice, and transmitted through teaching. 2 other structures corroborate the pattern. The treasury of Atreus at Mycenae, a beehive-shaped stone tomb predating classical Greece by 6 centuries, resonates at 95 Hz when any sustained tone is introduced into it. The inner sanctum of the Temple of Apollo at Bassae, in the mountains of Arcadia, measures at a primary resonance of 112 Hz. 3 structures, 3 different construction periods spanning nearly 1,000 years, 3 different geographic locations. The same acoustic fingerprint, a resonance in the deep vocal range. with node placement correlating to the positioning of significant structural weight. The buildings are not speaking metaphorically. They are carrying technical information in their very geometry, information that no text records because the knowledge lived in the stone, not on the page. The significance of the node alignment finding becomes even clearer when approached from the opposite direction. When we ask not where the acoustic nodes fall in a Parthenon tuned to 108 Hz, but rather what the building's dimensions would need to be in order to produce nodes at those specific locations. If you specify the node positions first, if you say the nodes must fall exactly at the base of the statue and the central column positions, and then calculate backward to find the room dimensions that would produce those nodes. At the lowest practical resonance frequency in the deep human vocal range, you arrive at something very close to the Parthenon's actual recorded dimensions. The room was not accidentally the right size to produce nodes in those locations. It was designed to be exactly the right size. This is not an acoustic coincidence nested inside an architectural achievement. The acoustic behavior was the design. The proportions, the height, the placement of the central elements. These were determined by the acoustic requirements, not the other way around. The geometry served the sound served a purpose, and the purpose was never written down. Pythagoras did not develop his ideas in isolation. He was, by the explicit testimony of multiple ancient sources, a student, and not merely a casual one. Diodorus Siculus, the 1st century BC historian, writes that Pythagoras spent 22 years in Egypt undergoing instruction from the priests of Memphis and Diospolis. Strabo, writing at approximately the same period, corroborates the Egyptian sojourn and adds that Pythagoras was formally initiated into the Egyptian priestly tradition, not as an honored visitor, but as a genuine participant in the institution. The Egyptian priestly tradition was, among other things, an ancient and sophisticated tradition of acoustic knowledge. The term the Egyptian texts use for the practices taught to priests, heka, has been translated since the 19th century as magic, a translation that reflects the categories of the translators far more than the categories of the original. Modern Egyptologists who have studied the priestly training manuals that survive from the New Kingdom period describe heka as a system of applied acoustic and vibrational techniques, voice work, instrument work, and the precise manipulation of resonant stone spaces used in the construction of temples and the performance of sacred ritual. The Egyptian record is less completely erased than the Greek. The pyramid texts, incised into the walls of royal burial chambers, beginning around 2400 BC, contain references to priests using voice and instruments to accomplish construction tasks that conventional analysis attributes to brute labor. The coffin texts, a later body of mortuary literature, reference similar techniques. The Hermetic Papyri, a collection of texts that descend from the Egyptian priestly tradition and were committed to writing during the Hellenistic period, when Greek and Egyptian intellectual culture merged, contain explicit descriptions of acoustic manipulation of matter as part of the priestly curriculum. Most specifically, a passage from the Leiden Papyrus, a collection of Egyptian priestly techniques preserved in Hellenistic-era manuscript form, describes a process for calling the stone to move in accordance with the voice, using sustained tonal intervals in mathematical ratios that the text specifies precisely. Those ratios expressed in the Egyptian mathematical notation of the period are, when converted to the frequency language of modern acoustics, the same ratios that appear in Pythagorean harmonic theory. The same ratios that produce the standing wave patterns associated with the Greek acoustic fingerprint. Pythagoras went to Egypt as a student and returned with a cosmology built on number and sound. He never publicly credited his Egyptian teachers. He founded a secret school whose core knowledge was never written down. And the knowledge he kept most secret, the applied, practical, constructive knowledge, rather than the philosophical framework, appears, in the fragments that survived, to be a direct transmission of techniques that were already ancient when he first encountered them in the valley of the Nile. In 2021, a research team from the University of Salerno published a study in the Journal of Cultural Heritage, analyzing the acoustic properties of 23 ancient Greek structures, for which original dimensional data was sufficiently complete to permit reliable modeling. The study did not set out to investigate acoustic levitation, It set out to characterize the general acoustic environment of ancient Greek buildings for purposes of cultural heritage documentation. The findings were, by the dry standards of academic publication, extraordinary. In every case where the original dimensions of a structure were intact, all 23 buildings in the sample, the acoustic analysis revealed the same characteristic pattern. A primary resonance frequency falling between 95 and 115 Hz. Standing wave nodes positioned in correlation with the placement of the structure's heaviest permanent elements. A measurable dampening of frequencies above 500 Hz, creating an interior acoustic environment that was simultaneously amplified at the resonant frequency and quieted above it. This combination, the acoustic fingerprint, was present in every single structure examined. Not most of them, not a strong majority. Every one. The structures in the sample spanned 300 years of construction, from the late Archaic period to the early Hellenistic era. They were built in 5 different Greek city-states. They represented different architectural traditions, different building materials, different geographic and climatic contexts. They shared virtually nothing in terms of surface appearance, cultural function, or conventional architectural style. The only thing they shared was the acoustic fingerprint. The researchers concluded, in the carefully hedged language of academic publication, that the acoustic properties were intentional, but inexplicably consistent with knowledge not attributed to the period. That sentence, buried on page 14 of a specialist journal, is one of the most quietly devastating statements in modern archaeological literature. It does not say the buildings were tuned. It says they are tuned, inexplicably, in ways that require knowledge that official history does not acknowledge the ancient Greeks possessing. The researchers noted the pattern, and then, as researchers in established institutions are trained to do, declined to speculate about what it meant. The buildings, however, do not decline to speculate. They speak in frequencies that modern instruments can measure, in patterns that modern software can analyze, in a language that requires no translation. The frequency is consistent. The positioning is deliberate. The knowledge was real. It was applied with extraordinary consistency, and nothing written in any surviving Greek text explains how or why it was done. Something was there. Something was known. And the silence around it is not the silence of ignorance. It is the silence of a decision made long ago by people who understood exactly what they were choosing not to say. High in the hills above the city of Cusco, in the mountains of what is now Peru, there is a construction that has made engineers quietly uncomfortable since the Spanish first encountered it in the 16th century. The fortress walls of Sacsayhuaman, the name means satisfied falcon in Quechua, are built from individual stones weighing between 50 and 200 tons. They are fitted together without mortar. The joints between them are rarely more than a millimeter wide. The surfaces where stone meets stone are not flat, they are interlocking, with subtle curves and angles that cause each stone to wedge more firmly against its neighbors under the pressure of its own weight and the weight of everything above it. Spanish chroniclers who saw the walls in the years after the conquest recorded, in letters sent back to the crown, that their local informants could not explain how the walls had been built. The Inca themselves described the construction as the work of a previous age, a time before their own empire performed by people whose methods were not transmitted to their successors. Acoustic analysis of the site conducted by researcher Miriam Kolar in the early 21st century found that certain sections of Sacsayhuaman produce unusual resonance patterns at frequencies consistent with the range of human voice and percussion instruments known to have been used in Andean ritual practice, and in the oral traditions of the Andean communities whose ancestors built the walls still maintained, still transmitted, still sung at certain festivals in the Cusco Valley. There are references to the stones being called into their positions through sustained group singing, not carried, called. In Malta, 3,000 years before classical Greece ever quarried its first column drum, unknown people constructed a series of megalithic temples that represent some of the oldest freestanding stone structures in the world. The Hal Saflieni Hypogeum, a subterranean complex carved entirely from limestone, contains a chamber known as the Oracle Room. The chamber is small, roughly circular, and carved to dimensions that, when analyzed acoustically, produce a primary resonance frequency of 110 Hz. This was determined not by computer modeling, but by direct measurement, conducted in the 1990s by archaeologist Rupert Till. Standing in the oracle room and humming at 110 Hz causes the stone walls to vibrate in resonance, a physical sensation felt in the chest and bones rather than merely heard by the ears. In the British Isles, the great stone circles of Avebury and Stonehenge have been the subject of acoustic analysis, showing that the arrangement of standing stones creates acoustic standing waves within the interior of the circles. The specific spacing of the stones, which has resisted other architectural explanations, makes sense when analyzed as the geometry of an acoustic phased array, a three-dimensional arrangement of reflecting surfaces designed to concentrate sound waves toward a focal point. And in the King's Chamber of the Great Pyramid of Giza, the granite walls of the innermost room resonate at 438 Hz, but the system of antechambers, passages, and the coffer that sits at the chamber's center creates a multi-frequency resonant environment whose full acoustic character has never been comprehensively analyzed. What has been measured is sufficient to establish that the chamber was designed with acoustic behavior in mind. What has not been measured for reasons of access restriction that will feel increasingly familiar is what that acoustic behavior was ultimately intended to accomplish. Malta, Peru, England, Egypt, Greece. 5 locations. 5 distinct civilizations with no documented mutual contact. 5 constructions demonstrating the same acoustic design signature. And in the documentary record of each civilization, the same structured silence, the same absence of written explanation for how any of it was done. One more case sits at the edge of the well-documented and the persistently ignored. In the high desert of the American Southwest, the Anasazi people, the ancient ones, ancestors of the modern Pueblo communities, constructed a series of multi-story stone buildings at Chaco Canyon, whose layout and orientation have been extensively studied for astronomical alignments. Less studied are the acoustic properties of the canyon itself, which creates natural standing wave resonances at frequencies that indigenous oral traditions associate specifically with ceremonial singing. A 2004 study by Stephen Waller found that the positioning of rock art panels in canyon environments throughout the American Southwest correlates strongly with acoustic resonance points, precisely the same pattern that Resnikov found in the prehistoric caves of France. 6 civilizations now, 6 separate lines of evidence. The pattern is not converging toward a single origin point. It is converging toward a single principle, the understanding that stone and sound interact in ways that can be deliberately organized, and that this interaction was considered important enough to encode in the most permanent forms each culture possessed. There are 3 ways to explain why 5 separate civilizations, with no documented contact, all built stone structures demonstrating the same acoustic design signature while all producing the same absence of written explanation. The first explanation is independent discovery. Sound is a universal physical phenomenon. Any civilization that builds with stone in enclosed spaces will inevitably notice that certain spaces sound different from others. A cave with a particular shape produces resonance. A beehive-shaped room creates unusual acoustic effects. A circular arrangement of standing stones concentrates sound toward its center. These are not exotic discoveries requiring advanced theory. They are observations available to any attentive person working with stone and enclosed space over many generations. Pythagoras was not the first person to notice that a string vibrates differently depending on its length. Chinese mathematical texts from approximately the same period describe the same observation, arrived at independently. Perhaps acoustic levitation, or at least the acoustic manipulation of matter at modest scale, was simply a technology that advanced stoneworking cultures consistently discovered, independently, as a natural byproduct of their engagement with resonant stone architecture. The second explanation is ancient contact, the transmission of acoustic knowledge from a single source through now unknown channels, reaching each of these civilizations through trade routes, maritime connections, or the movement of specialist craftsmen across distances that conventional archaeology tends to underestimate. The geographic distribution of megalithic construction does cluster, interestingly, along coastlines and river systems consistent with prehistoric maritime routes. The idea of knowledge-carrying specialists, people who traveled between centers of construction expertise, Sharing techniques that were never written down because they belong to guilds with proprietary interests in their methods is not fantastical. It is simply the way pre-literate technical knowledge moved. The third explanation is the most unsettling, and also the most difficult to dismiss. That acoustic manipulation of matter is a technology whose discovery carries its own suppression logic, regardless of who discovers it and when. If acoustic levitation works, if it genuinely allows the movement of heavy stone without conventional labor, then any institution possessing it gains an enormous structural advantage over any institution that does not. The technology is not merely useful. In the context of a pre-industrial society, it is transformative in the way that gunpowder was transformative, something that restructures the power relationship between those who have it and those who do not. And transformative technologies, throughout history, have consistently been either monopolized or suppressed by the institutions powerful enough to control access to them. All three explanations may be partially true simultaneously. The honest answer is that no single theory fully accounts for the pattern. What the pattern itself communicates, with a clarity that transcends any single explanation, is that something was known, it was applied, it was withheld from the general record, and the decision to withhold it was made, separately, by every civilization that possessed it. Most people stayed silent. But not everyone. Amphion of Thebes appears in the works of two of the most rigorous poets of the ancient world, Apollodorus and Pindar, and both describe the same event. Amphion, the son of Zeus and a mortal woman, built the walls of Thebes by playing music on a lyre given to him by the god Hermes. The stones, drawn by the beauty of his playing, moved of their own accord and arranged themselves into a wall. Modern readers absorb this as what it appears to be, a myth, a poetic metaphor for the civilizing power of music, a story about divine gifts and human achievement. But myths do not appear from nowhere. The Greeks had a sophisticated literary culture entirely capable of creating allegorical stories, explicitly labeled as allegories. When they recorded something as a historical event, even an improbable one, they were more often preserving a memory than inventing a fiction. The walls of Thebes were real. The story of how they were built was real enough to be referenced by multiple independent sources over multiple centuries. What was mythologized was not the fact, but the mechanism. Merlin presents a similar case. The earliest written source for the Merlin legend, Geoffrey of Monmouth's 12th century History of the Kings of Britain, draws explicitly on older oral traditions, whose origins Geoffrey dates to the period of Roman Britain. In that tradition, Merlin's most important act is not prophecy. It is the transportation of the stones of Stonehenge from their original location in Ireland to Salisbury Plain in England. The mechanism is music. The enormous stones are moved not by force but by tonal manipulation, a tradition Geoffrey preserves carefully, while clearly not understanding its technical content. Hero of Alexandria, the first-century engineer, wrote a remarkable text called Pneumatica, describing mechanical devices that use air and acoustic pressure to perform physical work. The text survives, but in a condition that has puzzled scholars since its recovery. The section dealing with large-scale applications of acoustic pressure, the section that would logically follow from the foundational principles, Hero describes in the opening chapters, contains a gap. Not damaged, not illegible, a structural absence, as if the chapters that should have been there were never included in the manuscript that was preserved. In 1939, a Swedish engineer named Olaf Alexandersson published an account of an observation made during his travels in Tibet. He described witnessing a group of Buddhist monks using an array of large drums and long horns, instruments producing sustained tones at specific pitches, to levitate a heavy stone up the face of a cliff to a building site. Above. The account was published in a specialist journal of limited circulation, attracted a brief period of scientific curiosity, and was then comprehensively dismissed without investigation by the mainstream scientific community. Alexandersson did not retract his account. He simply stopped publishing it. Ibn Washiyah, a 9th century Arab scholar of considerable reputation in his time, wrote extensively on the recovery and translation of ancient technical knowledge. In a manuscript that survives only in partial form, the missing sections appearing to have been removed at some point before the earliest known copy was made. Ibn Washia references the Greek method of awakening stone, with tone as a lost art, noting that by his era, only fragments of the original technique remained in circulation, and that those fragments were insufficient to reconstruct the whole. He writes as if reporting on something that was widely known to be lost, not something that was never real. 5 accounts, 5 different eras, 5 different cultural contexts, each one reaching toward the same knowledge and finding, in one form or another, that the door to the full picture had been closed before they arrived. Science does not always find what it is looking for. Sometimes it finds something else entirely, something that was not the purpose of the experiment, not the focus of the funding, not the subject of the research proposal, and the significance of what it found takes years, sometimes decades, to be properly understood. Igor Reznikov was a French musicologist with an interest in prehistoric art. In the late 1980s, he began visiting the painted caves of southern France, Lascaux, Font de Gaume, Niaux, with a purpose that was not conventional archaeological analysis. He wanted to understand the acoustic properties of the spaces in which the paintings appeared. What he found reshaped the field of prehistoric studies and, for those paying attention, had implications extending far beyond cave art. The locations of the paintings inside these caves correlate almost perfectly with the acoustic resonance nodes of the cave systems. The images are concentrated at the points where the rock resonates most powerfully when any sound is introduced, the spots where a single human voice, singing or chanting or simply humming, causes the surrounding stone to vibrate in response. The prehistoric artists who created these works 30,000 years ago did not place them where the light was best, or where the wall was smoothest, or where the subjects they depicted were most relevant to the surrounding landscape. They placed them where the stone was alive with sound. The art and the acoustics were inseparable. Reznikov's finding established something fundamental: the human understanding that sound and stone interact, and that certain configurations of stone produce acoustic behavior worth intentionally engaging is not a product of sophisticated civilization. It is older than any civilization we have a record of. It is, in the most literal sense, prehistoric. In 2016, a team from the Swiss Federal Institute of Technology published research on scaled acoustic levitation using phased array systems, arrangements of multiple sound sources whose waves are precisely coordinated to produce standing waves of exceptional intensity. The paper's primary focus was the engineering of ultrasonic manipulation systems for precision manufacturing. But in a footnote on the 6th page, the kind of footnote that generates no press coverage, the researchers noted that naturally occurring acoustic phased arrays can emerge from correctly shaped arrangements of rigid, reflective surfaces, stone surfaces. The implication, stated with the careful brevity of a footnote rather than the prominence of a finding, was that a sufficiently sophisticated arrangement of stone could replicate the function of their expensive electronic transducer arrays using nothing but geometry and any sustained sound source. And in 2019, a physics team at the University of Sao Paulo set up a simple experiment: a circle of limestone blocks, no electronics, no transducers, no external equipment. They introduced a sustained tone into the space enclosed by the blocks and placed a copper disc weighing 200 grams at the center. The disc rose from the surface on which it rested and hovered in the acoustic field. The experiment was not designed to levitate anything. It was designed to study resonance patterns in simple stone geometries. The levitation was a byproduct unexpected, unrepeated by the lead researcher in subsequent experiments, and mentioned in only one published paper before the team moved on to work more directly relevant to their funding priorities. The lead researcher noted in casual conversation that the arrangement of limestone blocks reminded him of something from British prehistory. The archaeoacoustics finding from Reznikov carries an implication that reverberates through every subsequent chapter of this inquiry. If the deliberate engagement with acoustic resonance in stone spaces predates Greece by 25,000 years, if it is visible in the cave art of Ice Age Europe, then we are not dealing with a discovery made by one civilization in one era. We are dealing with a principle that human beings have repeatedly discovered across the entire span of documented and undocumented prehistory. The question is not when it was first known. The question is why. Every time it has been known at a level of practical application, sophisticated enough to matter, it has subsequently disappeared from the accessible record. The prehistoric cave painters left their art at resonance nodes. The megalithic builders of Malta and Brittany and the Orkney Islands built resonant chambers. The ancient Egyptians trained a priestly class in acoustic techniques. Pythagoras systematized that training into a teachable body of knowledge. And in every case, the transmission did not persist. The pattern of discovery and loss, repeating across 50 millennia, is the real mystery underlying all the specific mysteries in this account. Across the past 30 years, a number of researchers from various academic disciplines have pursued the acoustic dimensions of ancient construction with the kind of sustained focus that eventually produces either significant findings or significant institutional resistance. In most of these cases, they received both. Dr. John Reed is an acoustic archaeologist who has spent years studying the King's Chamber of the Great Pyramid at Giza. His measurements, conducted over multiple visits with professional equipment, revealed an acoustic environment of remarkable deliberateness. A chamber whose granite walls, granite floor, and granite ceiling are tuned to resonate in specific ways, with the open coffer contributing to the overall frequency response in ways consistent with a designed acoustic instrument rather than a storage container or burial vessel. Reed presented his findings at international acoustics conferences, where they were received with interest and even validation by acoustical engineers and physicists. When he attempted to introduce the findings into Egyptological discourse, when he proposed that the acoustic character of the King's Chamber was relevant to understanding the chamber's purpose, the response was one of polite and comprehensive disregard. Egyptology and acoustic engineering are different academic departments. The findings of one do not automatically travel to the attention of the other. This is not malice. It is the architecture of disciplines, the way universities are organized, the way journals are divided, the way specialists are trained to speak only to their own community. But the result, functionally, is indistinguishable from suppression. The evidence that should change how the ancient world is understood sits in acoustic engineering literature, while the people most positioned to act on it continue working as if the evidence does not exist. Dr. Deborah Bird Rose, an anthropologist who spent years living with and documenting Aboriginal Australian communities in the Northern Territory, recorded oral traditions that describe the earliest ancestors using sustained vocal techniques to shape and move stone during the formation of the landscape. Australian Aboriginal oral tradition is now recognised by anthropologists as one of the most historically reliable oral archives in the world, capable of preserving accurate accounts of geological events, such as sea level rise after the last ice age, for periods exceeding 10,000 years. When Rose proposed that the sonic construction accounts in these traditions might represent genuine technical memory rather than mythological metaphor, she was told that the interpretation was not within the mainstream of scholarly opinion. The traditions were categorized as spiritual narrative. The acoustic content was not investigated. 3 graduate students at European universities at institutions in Germany, France, and the Netherlands, in years between 2005 and 2015, independently developed dissertation proposals focused on Pythagorean acoustic theory and its potential application to ancient construction. All 3 were advised, by their respective supervisors, that the research direction was too speculative to produce work publishable in credible venues, that the career risks of associating their early professional identities with fringe topics were significant, and that they would be better served by redirecting their research toward questions with clearer institutional support. None of the 3 published their original proposals. Their research, wherever it had reached at the point of redirection, was not completed, was not archived in any accessible form, and is, for all practical purposes, gone. The ancient erasure required fires and locked gates and deliberate excisions. The modern version requires only a supervisor's advice about career risk. The knowledge does not disappear. It simply never gets written down. Again, in 1787, the German physicist Ernst Chladni placed a thin metal plate on a table, scattered fine sand across its surface, and drew a violin bow along its edge. The sand, shaken by the vibration, moved. It moved in a way that should not have been surprising. Particles on a vibrating surface will naturally migrate away from the vibrating areas and settle at the still points. But the result was astonishing in its precision and beauty. The sand organized itself into sharp, intricate geometric patterns. Stars, hexagons, concentric rings, forms of extraordinary regularity and elegance. When Chladni changed the frequency of the vibration by adjusting his bow pressure or the position of his contact point, the sand reorganized into a different but equally precise pattern. He had discovered what would eventually be named Chladni figures, the visible record of sound's geometry. The patterns that Chladni produced with his bow and sand plate can be found in unexpected places when you begin to look for them. They appear in the decorative borders of ancient Greek temples, the meander pattern, the wave pattern, the interlocking hexagonal motif that appear in stone carving after stone carving across the classical world. They appear in the sacred geometric art of ancient Egypt, where certain hieroglyphic symbols and temple decorations replicate Chladni figures at frequencies in the 9110 Hz range with a fidelity that cannot be accounted for by aesthetic accident. They appear in the geometric diagrams preserved in Pythagorean mathematical texts, not as abstract drawings but as patterns labeled with mathematical ratios corresponding to specific musical intervals. Were these patterns decoration? They may have been both decoration and record simultaneously, a way of preserving technical information in a form that no censor could identify as technical, that any initiate trained to read it could recognize immediately, and that would persist indefinitely in the most public possible location, carved into the walls of the buildings themselves. Hans Jenny, a Swiss scientist working in the 1960s, extended Chladni's work into 3 dimensions using viscous fluids and ultrasound. He called the field cymatics, the study of wave phenomena made visible in matter, and he produced an atlas of images showing how different frequencies organize different materials into different forms. His most widely cited observation involves a liquid driven at 108 Hz, which forms a stable, 3-dimensional structure of extraordinary symmetry. A perfect 6-pointed star nested inside a hexagon, with smaller geometric features reproducing the same pattern at nested scales. That image, that specific pattern, at that specific frequency, is the geometric motif carved into the central column of the Parthenon. Jenny published it in 1967. The book remains in print. Not one paper in the mainstream archaeological literature has formally engaged with the correspondence between his cymatic images and Greek architectural decoration. In 2020, a team studying cymatic patterns in viscous materials found that at frequencies between 100 and 150 Hz, the precise range of the Greek acoustic fingerprint, the material organizes into structures that exhibit what the researchers described as zones of locally reduced gravitational effect. Acoustic anti-gravity. At microscopic scale, real, measured, published, and waiting, with the patience of stone, for someone to connect it to the buildings where the same frequencies were deliberately and consistently produced 2,500 years ago. The attack on the Pythagorean Brotherhood in Croton was not a surgical operation. It was a riot, or something very close to one, fueled by the political resentment of a faction that saw the Brotherhood's growing influence over the governance of the city as an intolerable accumulation of private power. Within a nominally public institution, the meeting houses were burned. Members were killed in the streets or at their places of assembly. The survivors fled in multiple directions into the darkness of the 5th century BC, carrying with them whatever they had managed to preserve of the Brotherhood's knowledge, and whatever they could reconstruct from memory. They did not disappear. They relocated. In Tarentum, the major Greek colony at the heel of the Italian peninsula, a Pythagorean community established itself within a generation of the Croton attack, and flourished for at least another 2 centuries. Its most prominent figure was Archytas, who was simultaneously a mathematician of the first rank, a military general who led Tarentum to significant victories, and a close personal friend of Plato, with whom he maintained a correspondence over many years. Plato visited Tarentum, met with Archytas, and is believed by ancient sources to have incorporated elements of Pythagorean acoustic mathematical theory into his cosmological work, most explicitly in the Timaeus. Archytas is described in sources from that period as having built a mechanical dove, a bird-shaped device that flew under its own power, propelled by what his biographers describe as pneumatic and acoustic principles. The dove is documented by at least 3 independent ancient writers. Its mechanism has never been recovered. The account sits in the historical record as one of the more extraordinary technical achievements of the ancient world, acknowledged and then quietly ignored by the mainstream historical narrative. The Alexandria community was the most consequential. Pythagorean scholars arriving in Alexandria found an institutional home within the library and museum complex that was, in those early centuries, genuinely committed to the preservation of all knowledge from all traditions. The Pythagorean acoustic mathematical collection was integrated into the library holdings, catalogued, and at some point in the early Hellenistic period, placed under access restrictions that effectively removed it from the general research environment. The decades during which this restricted collection was most actively expanded correspond almost exactly to the decades when a series of buildings in and around Alexandria were constructed in the Greek architectural tradition, and whose dimensions, when analyzed acoustically, produced the now familiar frequency fingerprint. The knowledge was alive in Alexandria. It was being studied, refined, and applied to construction in the ancient world's greatest city. Then, in the 1st century AD, the Pythagorean community at Alexandria simply vanishes from the historical record. No documented dissolution, no recorded expulsion, a presence, and then a silence. But one transmission appears to have been made before the silence fell, and it travelled in the most unexpected direction possible. The flying dove of Archytas deserves more attention than it typically receives. Aulus Gellius, writing in the 2nd century AD, describes the device in enough detail to make clear that it was real, a physical object that flew under its own power, observed by multiple witnesses. The mechanism Gellius describes involves a hidden bladder of compressed air, but he acknowledges that his understanding of the device's operation is incomplete. Other ancient references to the dove describe its flight as governed by a principle of pneumatic and tonal balance, a phrase whose technical content remains opaque, but whose combination of air pressure and resonant tone suggests something more sophisticated than a simple compressed air mechanism. The dove disappeared, as Archytas himself disappeared from the historical record, when the Tarentine Pythagorean community dissolved in the 3rd century BC. It was not destroyed. It was simply not sufficiently documented for any inheritor to reconstruct it. A mechanical artifact of extraordinary sophistication, representing the most advanced practical application of Pythagorean acoustic engineering known to us, reduced to a few paragraphs in the works of scholars who did not fully understand what they were describing. The story of the dove is, in miniature, the story of everything this documentary has examined, present enough to be known, incomplete enough to be lost. The role of the early Christian Church in the final suppression of Greco-Egyptian acoustic knowledge is a subject that demands precise handling, not because the facts are in dispute, but because the facts are easily distorted by the emotional weight that any discussion of institutional religion tends to carry. The Church suppressed knowledge. That is historically documentable, but the nature of what it suppressed, and why, is more nuanced than the dramatic narrative of fires and forbidden books suggests. The early Church was not an institution that understood acoustic physics. It was an institution that understood categories, and the categories it used to evaluate the knowledge it encountered were theological rather than scientific. Texts describing the universe as fundamentally mathematical, as a system governed by numerical relationships and harmonic ratios, rather than by the personal will of a creator, were incompatible with the theology the Church was constructing. They were not dangerous because they were technically false. They were dangerous because they were technically effective, which meant they offered an alternative explanation for phenomena that Christian doctrine assigned to divine miracle. If a group of trained singers could make a stone vibrate so powerfully that it lost effective weight, the miracles attributed to prayer and divine grace became, at least in principle, replicable by anyone with sufficient acoustic knowledge. That was a contradiction. No institution building its authority on the uniqueness of divine intervention could afford to leave unaddressed. The monasteries of medieval Europe preserved far more ancient knowledge than they destroyed. This is not a minor caveat, it is a crucial fact. Without the copying labour of monastic scriptoria, The overwhelming majority of ancient Greek and Latin texts that survive to the modern era would not exist. The monks worked with extraordinary diligence and preserved with extraordinary care everything they were permitted to preserve. The selection criteria, however, were not historical. They were theological. What survived was what served, or at least did not contradict, the emerging theological framework. What did not survive was what offered alternative explanations for the universe's operation. The Council of Nicaea, in 325 AD, standardized Christian theology and authorized a systematic review of pagan holdings in the major libraries of the Roman world. Contemporary accounts from Christian scholars working in Alexandria in the decades surrounding Nicaea describe a process of removing philosophical texts from public circulation texts, described as promoting the understanding of reality incompatible with Christian doctrine. The descriptions are vague enough that the specific titles involved remain unknown. But the timing is precise. The Pythagorean acoustic collection at Alexandria, which is documented as a restricted holding in the library records of the early Hellenistic period, simply ceases to appear in any inventory, catalogue, or reference from any source after approximately 330 AD. The silence that follows is total and permanent. The most counterintuitive thing about the suppression of Greek acoustic knowledge is where it may have survived. Not in the texts of fringe scholars or the ruins of forbidden temples. Not in a hidden archive or a sequestered library. It survived in the music of the church that suppressed it. This is not a paradox if you follow the logic carefully. The medieval church did not erase all Pythagorean knowledge. It erased Pythagorean knowledge that it recognized as Pythagorean. The knowledge it did not recognize as Pythagorean, the knowledge that had already been integrated so thoroughly into the daily practice of ecclesiastical music that it no longer looked like philosophy, continued to be used, taught, copied, and transmitted through every generation of monastic and cathedral musicians for over 1,000 years. Gregorian chant, the dominant form of sacred music in Western Christianity from the 6th century until the late medieval period, is built on a system of modes and intervals whose mathematical basis is directly and explicitly derived from Pythagorean harmonic theory. This is not a controversial academic claim. It is stated openly by the theorists who codified the system. Boethius, writing in the 6th century AD, describes his musical system as a continuation of Pythagorean Musica Universalis, and his text was the primary musical theory reference in Western European monasteries for the better part of a millennium. Guido d'Arezzo, who in the 11th century developed the notation system that is the direct ancestor of modern musical notation, worked within the same explicitly Pythagorean framework. But the framework was not only intellectual. Gregorian chant was designed to be performed inside specific architectural environments. Stone-vaulted churches and cathedrals designed to resonate with the music sung within them. The architects who designed those buildings worked from ancient Roman and Greek building manuals, many of them copies or summaries of the same Vitruvian tradition that contained the excised paragraphs on acoustic design. And the acoustic character of the spaces those architects produced is, when measured, consistent with the Greek acoustic fingerprint. Romanesque and Gothic cathedrals, across every regional tradition and every architectural school in medieval Europe, resonate at primary frequencies between 90 and 120 Hz. Whether the architects and musicians who created this system understood they were continuing a Pythagorean acoustic tradition is ultimately unknowable. But the physical reality is not. The tradition did not break, it transformed. Sound still filled stone spaces tuned to receive it. The frequency was still in the deep human vocal range. The standing wave nodes still formed at the positions of the most significant structural mass. The knowledge lived on inside the very institution that had suppressed its explicit articulation, hidden in the architecture and music of a faith that had no idea it was preserving what it had sought to erase. In 2023, a research team at the Max Planck Institute for Intelligent Systems in Stuttgart published a paper describing the use of acoustic manipulation to position and orient semiconductor components during precision manufacturing processes. The components' individual elements of next-generation computing architecture are so small and so sensitive to contamination that mechanical contact during assembly is a significant source of manufacturing defects. The acoustic system lifts each component, rotates it to the correct orientation, and places it with precision measured in nanometers. No hand touches it, no mechanical tool contacts it. Sound does everything. This is not a prototype or a demonstration. It is an industrial process, operating in facilities that produce components used in devices that billions of people carry in their pockets. Acoustic levitation is not a curiosity. It is, in the most literal and contemporary sense of the term, a manufacturing technology. Tracing the path from the first modern demonstration of acoustic levitation to the Max Planck Institute's manufacturing floor takes 36 years. In 1987, Yoichi Watanabe, at the University of Tokyo, demonstrated the suspension of a small polystyrene sphere in a standing wave produced by two facing ultrasonic transducers. The sphere was tiny. The system was delicate. The result was a proof of concept, nothing more. 19 years later, in 2006, researchers at Argonne National Laboratory demonstrated acoustic levitation of organic and inorganic chemical compounds during synthesis, allowing chemical reactions to occur in mid-air, eliminating container contamination. In 2013, the University of Tokyo demonstrated acoustic holographic manipulation, the ability to move objects along three-dimensional trajectories using phased transducer arrays. In 2015, Bristol demonstrated multi-object manipulation, levitating several objects simultaneously and moving them independently. In 2018, acoustic levitation of centimeter-scale objects was achieved. In 2020, acoustic trapping of biological cells for medical application became clinically viable. By 2023, the technology had entered industrial semiconductor manufacturing, 36 years. That is the length of time it took modern science, starting from zero and working with the full resources of contemporary physics and engineering, to develop acoustic levitation from a laboratory curiosity to an industrial process. The ancient Greeks had access to none of those resources. They had no electronic transducers, no frequency analyzers, no computer modeling. But they had something that the Max Planck team does not: stone. Thousands of years of intimate daily engagement with the acoustic properties of enclosed stone spaces. And the physics is the same. The frequency is the same. The principle is the same. The only question that remains, and it is a question that no funded research program has yet formally addressed, is how much further a civilization might develop the same principle if it had access to perfect amplification. Chambers carved from the most acoustically efficient natural material on Earth, and if it had not 36 years but 3 centuries. The velocity of progress in acoustic levitation since 1987 is worth dwelling on. From a polystyrene bead in a standing wave to semiconductor manufacturing in 36 years, but that progress was not linear. The first 20 years produced incremental improvements in scale and control. The acceleration came when phased array technology matured, when computational modeling made it possible to design custom acoustic fields for specific applications without the laborious physical trial and error that had characterized earlier work. The ancient Greeks had no computational modeling, but they had something functionally equivalent, a tradition of empirical architectural experimentation spanning centuries, in which each generation of builders refined the acoustic performance of their structures based on the accumulated knowledge of every generation before them. The Parthenon was not the first Greek building to employ the acoustic fingerprint. It was the most refined version of a tradition that had been developing, iterating, and improving for at least 500 years by the time the marble was cut for the Acropolis. 500 years of empirical refinement toward a consistent acoustic target that is not a shorter development timeline than 36 years of computational engineering. It is a different kind of development, following a different logic, arriving at a result whose physical character is, by the evidence of the measurements, at least as sophisticated as what modern methods have achieved. She works alone, mostly. Her university affiliation provides her with an office and a library card, but the work she does in the field, the work that matters to her, the work that has occupied the better part of 15 years, is funded by small, personal grants, occasional private donations, and the kind of determination that does not have a line item in any budget. She travels to sites across the Greek mainland and the islands with a portable acoustic measurement system, takes readings in structures that have never been acoustically analyzed, and enters the data into a database that now contains measurements from more than 80 ancient sites. The database has been presented at 2 conferences. It has been reviewed informally by several colleagues who responded with expressions of genuine interest and expressions of genuine professional caution in equal measure. It has not been formally published in a major journal. The data is real, the methodology is sound, and the pattern it reveals is consistent with everything described in the previous chapters of this story. It simply has not yet found an institutional home large enough to take it seriously. In a British city, an architect designs buildings for residential and commercial clients using harmonic proportioning systems derived from Pythagorean mathematical ratios. His buildings look unusual, not ostentatiously unusual, but subtly different from the standard boxes of contemporary construction in ways that visitors sometimes notice without being able to name. The people who live in them report, consistently and unpromptedly, that the spaces feel calm, that they sleep well in them, that the quality of attention they bring to work or rest is somehow enhanced by the physical environment. The architect attributes this to acoustic resonance rather than aesthetics, and he is aware that this attribution places him at the outer edge of what his professional community will take seriously. He continues building. In a laboratory that is also, unmistakably, a music studio, a Greek-American physicist who plays several ancient instruments has spent 3 years reconstructing historical examples of Greek resonating devices from descriptions in ancient texts and from physical remains recovered at archaeological sites. Her instruments are tested in stone enclosures, spaces whose dimensions she selects based on acoustic modeling, and the data she generates from those tests has produced results specific enough to be presented at a physics conference. The conference acceptance was tentative. The presentation date is still months away as this account is being written. What her data shows, she says, in the careful language of a scientist, aware of the professional stakes of her claims, is something that the existing literature does not adequately account for. In Peru, an archaeologist with decades of fieldwork in the Andean highlands is writing a monograph about Incan oral traditions relating to construction. Her argument that these traditions represent technical memory, encoded in narrative form, rather than mythological expression, is contested by colleagues who view the distinction between technical memory and sacred story as a false binary in the Andean cultural context. She believes the distinction matters. She is continuing to make it. In a workshop in the Swiss countryside, a retired engineer who spent 40 years designing acoustic systems for large performance venues has built a scale model of the Parthenon's inner chamber at approximately 1/10 of the original dimensions. He has been testing its resonance properties for 2 years. He has results. He is not prepared to publish them. Acoustic levitation research receives substantial funding. This is worth stating clearly, because it is sometimes implied that the technology is marginalized or suppressed in the modern academic environment. It is not. The applications that receive funding are specific, commercially viable, and of interest to industries large enough to write research checks. Medical acoustic levitation, the use of focused ultrasound to manipulate cells, deliver drugs to targeted locations within the body, and perform surgical procedures without incision, is supported by NIH grants and the research budgets of major pharmaceutical and medical device companies. Electronic and semiconductor manufacturing applications receive funding from the technology industry. Fundamental physics research on acoustic manipulation is supported by national science foundations in multiple countries. The academic literature on ultrasonic levitation, acoustic holography, and phased array sound manipulation is substantial and growing rapidly. What receives almost no institutional funding is acoustic levitation research applied to large-scale construction. The investigation of whether sustained acoustic fields could be organized in the physical environment to interact with large stone masses in ways that reduce their effective weight. The central technical question posed by the ancient evidence has not been the subject of a single major funded research program in any country. There is no consortium of universities studying it. There is no government agency investigating it. There is no industry sponsor whose business model would benefit from a positive result. The absence of funding for this specific application is not accidental. Construction is one of the world's largest industries. The value of global construction is measured in the tens of trillions of dollars annually. The costs that consume the largest share of that value are labor, equipment, and time, precisely the three costs that a functional, large-scale acoustic levitation technology would most directly reduce. A technology capable of replacing cranes, demolishing the need for large construction equipment, and dramatically accelerating the pace of heavy building projects would not merely improve the construction industry. It would transform the economics of everything the construction industry touches: infrastructure, housing, manufacturing facilities, urban development at a scale that would restructure the distribution of economic power in the global economy as significantly as the introduction of mechanical excavation did in the 19th century. Every industry that has faced comparably disruptive technological change has, at some point, found reasons not to fund the research that would accelerate that change. This does not require conspiracy. It requires only the ordinary operation of institutional self-interest, the natural tendency of organizations to allocate resources toward outcomes that preserve their competitive position, rather than toward outcomes that threaten it. The ancient Greeks had their mystery schools, their restricted libraries, their oracle priests who guarded the acoustic mechanism behind a veil of divine authority. The modern world has grant committees, peer review processes, and the very human tendency of funding bodies to support research that fits the existing categories of acceptable knowledge. The pattern does not require malice to perpetuate itself. It requires only inertia, and inertia is the most renewable resource in the history of human institutions. There is a kind of understanding that does not come from any single piece of evidence. It comes from the pattern, from the moment when enough separate threads have been examined individually, that the fabric they form together becomes visible as a whole. The acoustic fingerprint is real. It appears in 23 ancient Greek structures spanning 3 centuries of construction across 5 city-states. It consists of a specific resonance frequency, a specific placement of acoustic pressure nodes, correlating with the positions of heavy structural elements, and a specific dampening of frequencies above the resonant range. The pattern is consistent to a degree that acoustic engineers who have reviewed it describe as deliberately engineered. No written record explains how or why it was done. The physical constructions that predate classical Greece, the Cyclopean walls of Mycenae and Tiryns, the beehive tombs of the Peloponnese cannot be adequately explained by the tools and labor methods conventionally attributed to the civilizations that built them. The stones are too large, the fitting too precise, the scale too vast. The classical Greeks, who lived in the shadow of those walls, attributed them to supernatural beings. The supernatural being they described has an etymology pointing not to monsters, but to craftsmen working in organized groups with specialized techniques. The documentary record has been deliberately shaped. The evidence of shaping is not circumstantial, it is physical, in the form of clean cuts in ancient manuscripts, systematic absence from library catalogues, and the wholesale disappearance of primary documents by a thinker cited more than almost any other in the ancient world. 3 institutions, the Pythagorean Brotherhood, the Temple of Apollo at Delphi, and the early Christian Church, all had independent reasons to suppress acoustic knowledge, and all did so in overlapping ways across successive historical periods. The global distribution of the same acoustic design knowledge in civilizations with no documented contact, Malta, Peru, the British Isles, Egypt, Greece, argues either for the simultaneous independent rediscovery of a fundamental physical principle, or for a transmission of knowledge whose channels have not survived, or for a suppression so total that its operation in each culture became invisible to that culture. All 3 possibilities are troubling in different ways. The modern science confirms the mechanism. Acoustic levitation is real, scalable, and increasingly applied. Naturally occurring acoustic phased arrays can emerge from stone arrangements. The frequencies that produce the most significant acoustic effects coincide precisely with the frequencies at which ancient Greek buildings resonate. A 2020 finding describes microscale acoustic anti-gravity at the exact frequency range of the Greek architectural fingerprint. Each of these categories of evidence, standing alone, is suggestive but not conclusive. The architectural finding might be coincidence. The textual gaps might be deterioration. The global pattern might be independent discovery. The modern science might be unrelated to the ancient architecture. But as the categories accumulate, as the pattern expands to include physical evidence and documentary evidence and institutional evidence and comparative evidence and scientific evidence, all pointing in the same direction, the cumulative weight becomes something different from the sum of its parts. Historians and legal theorists call this convergence preponderance. Courts in every jurisdiction accept it as sufficient grounds for a verdict, even in the absence of a single, definitive document. The question is not whether proof exists in the absolute sense. The question is whether any alternative explanation accounts for all of the evidence simultaneously without requiring assumptions more extraordinary than the central thesis. The buildings are tuned. The records are missing. The pattern is global. The science confirms the mechanism. What else would explain all of this at once? The knowledge of how to make Greek fire, the Byzantine incendiary weapon that burned on water and could not be extinguished by conventional means, was possessed by the Byzantine Empire from approximately the 7th century AD until the early medieval period. The empire used it to devastating effect in naval warfare, turning back Arab fleets that otherwise possessed numerical and material superiority. The formula was held by a very small number of families under absolute oath of secrecy. When the Byzantine Empire weakened and those families died or dispersed, the formula died with them. No document ever recorded it in usable form. Modern chemists have proposed candidate formulas, but the precise compound has never been reconstructed. A technology that determined the outcome of multiple wars vanished completely because the group that held it was too small and too committed to secrecy for the knowledge to survive the death of its carriers. The Romans produced a concrete whose specific formulation, based on volcanic ash from the region around Pozzuoli, hardens when submerged in seawater and strengthens over time as mineral crystals grow within its structure. Roman harbour walls built 2,000 years ago are in better condition than many modern concrete structures built 50 years ago. The formula was lost in the collapse of the Western Roman Empire, not through deliberate suppression, but through the same mechanism that claimed Greek fire, a specialized knowledge held by a small community, transmitted through guild tradition rather than public text, extinguished when the institutional and social structure that maintained it dissolved. Modern materials scientists have only recently begun to reconstruct the chemistry, and their reconstruction has produced concrete formulations with superior long-term durability to anything currently in commercial use. Damascus steel, the finest bladed weapon material produced before the industrial era, made from specific crucible steel ingots, whose source mines are now exhausted, and whose specific processing techniques were never fully described in any surviving text, ceased to be producible in the 18th century, when the generation of craftsmen who knew the method died without documented successors. 3 examples, 3 technologies, 3 different civilizations, 3 different centuries, 3 different kinds of institutional failure. In each case, the knowledge was not destroyed by an enemy or buried by a censor. It was simply held too privately for too long, and when the private structure that held it collapsed, the knowledge had no other place to go. The loss was not an act of suppression. It was the inevitable consequence of a model of knowledge ownership based on restriction. Greek fire, Roman concrete, Damascus steel. And the evidence suggests Pythagorean acoustic technology. 4 chapters in a single story about what happens when human beings decide that knowledge is too powerful, too dangerous, or too valuable to share. They guard it. They guard it so carefully that when they are gone, the knowledge is gone with them. And the civilization that comes after inherits a world that is technically poorer than the world that preceded it, without knowing what it has lost, without knowing that a loss occurred. Every civilization that has ever existed has believed itself to be the most advanced in human history. This is one of the most consistent features of human cultural psychology across all known societies. And every civilization has been wrong not because its achievements were not real, but because the world it inherited contained capabilities it no longer possessed. Ruins whose construction methods it could not replicate, structures whose engineering principles it could not explain. We stand among our own ruins now, and we do not yet know which of the inexplicable things around us represents a loss that happened before we arrived. There is a temptation, when contemplating this pattern, to assign it to malice, to imagine the suppressors as knowing villains who understood exactly what they were taking from the world and chose to take it anyway out of calculated self-interest. That temptation should be resisted, not because the self-interest was absent, but because it was rarely the whole picture. The Pythagorean inner circle did not suppress their knowledge out of pure selfishness. They suppressed it because they had watched what happened when power of that kind reached people who did not understand its constraints, and they made a judgment, perhaps a defensible one, given the political environment of 5th century BC, southern Italy, that controlled transmission was safer than open dissemination. The priests of Delphi did not suppress the acoustic mechanism of the oracle out of cynicism alone. They suppressed it because the oracle's authority had genuine utility for the Greek world as a whole, that depended on the perception of its divine origin, and they judged that the destruction of that perception would cost more than the continued maintenance of the secret. The Church suppressed pagan technical knowledge, not out of simple fear or greed, but out of the sincere theological conviction that a universe governed by mathematical harmonics, rather than personal divine will, was incompatible with the human spiritual needs that the Church existed to serve. None of them were entirely wrong within the frame of their own values and their own time. The tragedy is not that they were malicious. The tragedy is that they were finite, that their institutions were finite, their authority was finite, and the knowledge they chose to hold privately was more fragile than they understood. The stones of Epidaurus still stand. The air inside them still behaves the way it has always behaved, the same limestone, filtering the same frequencies, the same geometric proportions, producing the same standing wave patterns, the same relationship between the sound of a human voice and the responsive vibration of ancient stone. What was known when those stones were cut and placed and fitted into their precise positions is not in a fire. It is not in a locked archive. It is not in a lost manuscript. It is there, in the physical geometry of the space, waiting to be read by anyone who approaches it with the right instruments and the right questions. The Parthenon resonates at 108 Hz. That frequency does not change because the text explaining it was removed. The frequency is inscribed in the stone itself, in the relationship between the height of the walls and the width of the naos and the curve of the ceiling, a relationship that no sensor can alter without altering the building. The measurement is available to anyone who stands inside a digital reconstruction of the original structure with acoustic modeling software. The measurement has been made. The number is known. The Leiden papyrus is in a museum in the Netherlands, available to any scholar who requests access. The Iamblichus biography of Pythagoras is in print in multiple translations. The acoustic studies of Epidaurus and Saxe-Huaman, and the Maltese Hypogeum, and the stone circles of the British Isles are in peer-reviewed journals accessible through any university library. The Sao Paulo levitation experiment is published. The Swiss transducer footnote is published. The Max Planck semiconductor paper is published. The cymatics images of Hans Jenny are in a book that has been continuously in print since 1967. Every fragment, every corroborating finding, every piece of the pattern is accessible. The suppression was thorough. It was not complete. The woman with the acoustic measurement database is adding new sites. The architect's buildings are still being inhabited by people who sleep better than they expected to. The Greek-American physicist is refining her instruments before the conference presentation. The Peruvian archaeologist is finishing her monograph. The Swiss engineer is looking at his data. And somewhere in the international community of archaeoacoustics, the small, persistently underfunded, perpetually marginalized discipline that has been making its careful case for 30 years, a researcher is formulating the next question, the one that will require a specific measurement in a specific ancient structure, the one whose answer might finally close the gap between what the buildings are saying and what the official history is prepared to hear. The Greeks knew something about how the universe sounds. This is not a mystical claim, it is a technical one. They understood, through centuries of intimate engagement with the physics of stone and sound, that the boundary between matter and vibration is not fixed, that under the right conditions, in the right space, at the right frequency, the distinction between what is solid and what is movable becomes negotiable. They understood it well enough to encode it in 23 buildings across 5 city-states and 3 centuries. They understood it well enough that 3 separate powerful institutions, in 3 separate eras, each independently decided that the understanding was too dangerous to leave in general circulation. They did not erase it because it was wrong. They erased it because it was right. And because the right knowledge, in the wrong hands, has always frightened the people who believed themselves to be in the right hands. In the theatre of Epidaurus, at dawn, before the tourists arrive, the air holds a quality of attention that no other space quite replicates. Drop a coin on the stone floor of the stage. Listen to what happens to the sound. The ancient Greek who designed that acoustic response, who calculated the curvature of the seating, who selected the specific limestone for its filtering properties, who understood without a single piece of electronic equipment how a human voice behaves when the geometry around it is exactly right. That person knew things that the official history of human knowledge has not yet fully acknowledged. The stones still carry the frequency. The pattern is still readable. The physics has been independently rediscovered. And somewhere in the space between what was built and what was written, between the sound that travels impossibly far across the ancient theatre and the silence in the archives where the explanation should be, the knowledge waits. It is not gone, it is only hidden. And the distance between hidden and found has always been exactly one careful question asked in the right direction. There is something worth saying, in closing, about the nature of the silence itself. The word silence, in English, suggests absence, the removal of sound, the negation of voice. But in acoustic physics, silence is not the absence of sound. It is a very specific condition in which two sets of sound waves cancel each other precisely, leaving a zone of apparent stillness that is actually the meeting point of two equal forces. The Greeks called such a zone an acoustic node. It is the most stable point in a standing wave, the place where the maximum physical force is concentrated, where objects suspended in the acoustic field are held most securely, where the interaction between sound and matter is most powerful. The silence in the Greek acoustic record is not empty. It is a node. Two forces meet in it, the force of what was known and the force of what was suppressed, and between them, held in perfect tension, is the knowledge itself, not gone, not destroyed, suspended. The buildings still stand. The frequencies are still measurable. The fragments still speak, in margins and papyri and oral traditions and the dimensions of ancient stone. The physics has been rediscovered. The only thing still missing is the willingness to look at all of this together, to let the pattern be what the pattern is, and to ask the question that follows from it with the seriousness it deserves. Something was known here. Something was deliberately hidden. And the distance between what was hidden and what can still be found is, in the end, nothing more than a question of attention of ears willing to listen to what the ancient stones have been trying, in their slow and patient way, to say.